You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome again. This is going to be our final official presentation of our writing retreat. Tomorrow we are going to have a Q&A session. We're not going to be broadcasting ourselves for that, but we will be on chat starting at 1 o'clock. If you have questions now, go ahead and ask them, or just join us tomorrow and ask the questions as we go.
During that time period, we would like to see some of the writing sprints that you've been doing, maybe something that you're interested in sharing with the class. So we can start the conversation going on your story specifically, how these concepts we've talked about all week will apply to you and your specific experience.
So let's get into today. Today we are going to be, this time, we're going to be talking about structuring your plot. Pantsers, don't tune out. This is still very good information for you to have moving forward.
Having a good plot is vital to making sure your readers are entertained in the story. So first we want to start off with a quote from C.S. Friedman.
Life is a richly layered experience. Choices are never simple or clear. If the choices in your story are simple, no one will believe the world you have created is real. C.S. Friedman. So, plot structures, finding the right one for your story, because there are many different kinds of plot structures, and it's not a one-size-fits-all for them.
First thing to understand about how to approach plot structures is how you approach writing. I am a plotter.
I'm a pantser drifting towards plantser.
We're trying to push her up. You may recognize this grid as something similar to what we saw earlier this week when we were talking about your character design, your character alignments. Your writer alignment has less to do with good and evil and more to do with how you think about approaching your story.
I probably fall into the lawful plantser section. I know the ending and I write towards it. I love world building, and I use character bios, and I've taken personality tests for those characters.
I'm closer to a neutral plotter. That means I do have an outline. I write down what I want to happen when. I use beat sheets, especially in those fight scenes. We talked about that yesterday. And the outline is still fluid. Not only am I following the structure that I have in my head, but I'm answering the instincts and answering the characters as we experience the story together.
So once you figure out kind of where you land on this chart, what kind of plotter or pantser or plantser you are, you know how you need to go about building a plot. Even if you're a pantser, you need to have structure to your story. It may not start out that way, but when you're editing, you need to make sure that you have some structure, some flow. So today's topic, we are going to be talking about that. And it incorporates everything else we've talked about through this entire week. So on Monday, we talked about character.
We talked about understanding what your characters do and how they change throughout the story, as well as their backstories and how it influences the characters as they're going through the struggles that you put before them. The next thing we talked about, day 2, was world building.
And that's my favorite part. I have intricate world building for every story that I write. We talked about the actual world itself, and then developing the culture, as well as the magic and the creation of everything. Why is this so hard for me today?
Our third pillar of story is what we've been talking about today. That is that structure, that conflict, the pieces of the story that change from the beginning to the end. Your character bio pretty much stays the same. Your world building pretty much stays the same. The conflict and the change in that conflict is what we're talking about today, and how to progress and make your story entertaining.
So the first thing we need to look at is, what is the plot? Simple, boiled down, your plot is the problem and the solution. Whatever problem at the beginning gets resolved in the end, and everything that they do in the in-between should be working towards that.
Understanding where that problem starts and where that solution ends will help make sure that your readers are hooked and continuing to read, because a lot of the stuff happening before the problem, it can be backstory. We don't want to have a history lesson before we get to the reason why we're reading the book.
So, to kind of know where your plot starts and where it ends, we're going to look at the structures, the different kinds of structures. We're going to talk about 5 today. We have the 3-act structure, the 7-point structure,
which both kind of go hand in hand. We have the Fichtean Curve, which has a lot of that tension and release that's vital for keeping readers engaged without exhausting them. And of course, the 2-act structure, which you see a lot on stage.
And Freytag's pyramid, which she skipped, which is also known as the 5-act structure. So, any of those 5 structures have key moments in the story. All of them will have these elements in there that need to be there for a satisfying plot.
So generally speaking, in all of those structures, your inciting incident is going to be right near the beginning. It's going to be definitely in that first half. If it takes longer than that, then consider cutting out the first couple of chapters. Get to the good part.
After your inciting incident, you're needing to make sure, let me rephrase that back up. Along with the inciting incident, in the first half of your story, you need to introduce the relevant characters. Any character that is going to play a role in the end of the story needs to be introduced within the first half of your story. In a murder mystery, this includes the murderer. They need to be in existence within the first half of the story. Otherwise, the ending, the reveal that they're the murderer, doesn't make sense.
And of course, that lie we talked about when we were talking about designing your main character should become fairly obvious to the reader. It might not necessarily become obvious to your character. If your character's lie is, I'm the best person on the face of the planet, that'll take them a little bit longer to discover than something like a deep-seated depression.
And then anything that you have that may be a content warning or a trigger warning, you need to establish that it exists within the first half of your story. Nobody wants to get 3/4 of a way through a story and all of a sudden be confronted with a different maturity level rating event that they weren't expecting earlier on.
And the last thing you have to make sure you do in the first half of your story is establish those footholds. Make sure that you are putting those pieces in place for you to build upon later. This goes for comedy, jokes that are running throughout the entire thing. Any of your rule of 3, at least have your first, if not your first and your second, in the first half of your story.
And then in your second half, you're going to have a darkest moment. That time where your character is broken and they feel like they cannot move on.
That is often a reflection of that lie. It's proven true to them in that moment. And they have to get past it by solving that internal conflict before they can move forward and solve the external conflict and conquer the villain.
And then you're, of course, going to have your climax, that final battle, and the denouement, which is the kind of fall afterwards.
That's going to be a lot of your happily ever after. Your characters are returning to a new world where they are experiencing, the king is granting them all sorts of good things for defeating the dragon.
And then you need to make sure you pay off any of the red herrings, any of the footholds that you established. All of those loose ends kind of need to get tied up. The exception being if you're planning to do a series, you can leave some loose ends there that you can resolve in further books. So let's get into the actual structures. We're going to start with the 3-act structure. This is probably the most common as well as the most basic. These other structures, some of them can fit within the 3-act structure system.
You're going to see this especially in a lot of popular media. In film is where a lot of this pops up. Disney is very famous for doing this kind of 3-act structure. And when you listen to the podcast, you'll also hear us talk about Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. We're in general talking about thirds of the book, not necessarily that you are going with this particular structure.
So you can kind of see that there's rise and fall within the story. Most of the structures we talk about today have some kind of rise and fall throughout. So in Act 1, the very first thing you're going to have in Act 1 is what's called exposition. That's the very first point.
If you're going with the Pixar model of storytelling, that's the everyday Carl Fredricksen woke up and sat on his front porch and protested the construction around his building.
So you introduce your relevant characters within this introduction, this exposition segment.
You're also establishing that status quo so that we know what it used to be like before it gets disrupted. This is Luke at the farm, at the moisture farms.
And then you need to establish broad information about the world. You're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the magic system, but you need to establish that magic exists. You need to establish the idea of the world, that broad view of it, and how the character exists within it.
And of course, I tend to skip straight to the inciting incident. That's something I'm working on. The inciting incident is the fun part. This is where the bad guy comes in and destroys the farm and kills Aunt Owen and Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. This is the moment that launches your hero into the journey. Something is changing in his world. So every day until one day.
It's that catalyst. Another thing that you need to do within Act 1, like we kind of talked about within the first half, is introduce those potential triggers. I like to have them in Act 1, not just in the first half of the book, because you want your readers to know kind of what to expect.
Act 2 is really the hard part in especially a lot of the Pantsers worlds. This is where it feels like you want to just rush on to Act 3, but you have all this stuff you have to put in first. Your energy levels can start to drag, so it's important to pay a lot of attention to what Act 2 has to offer for your audience.
So first off, you have plot point 1. This is the turning point that kind of, a lot of the times it's the decision of the main character to take what happened in the inciting incident and do something about it.
This will break the status quo for your characters and start to break the status quo for the characters around them. The parents that are watching their kid go off to war. It changes their world as well.
After that decision, after they go off and decide to take on this adventure, you have the rising action. This is the build towards the big event. This is a build towards a big event, not necessarily the climax. During the rising action, the character usually starts to think that the lie they believe about themselves is actually a lie.
They're starting to hear voices of maybe the love interest or other characters telling them, hey, this is how life actually is.
And that leads them to the midpoint in the story. This is usually some kind of event that they have a conflict with the villain of some kind where things don't work. They fail.
They think they're getting an idea of how to do things here. A lot of your training montages end up here. This is Hercules going in and being defeated by the monster for the first time.
So it's that significant event that goes wrong.
This makes your characters ask themselves if it's worth it. They initially decide, okay, yeah, I think I should stand up. Somebody needs to stand up to this bad guy. They're starting to recognize the cost of what they're doing at this midpoint.
And what the hero wants is threatened in some way. There is a direct challenge that is stepping and standing in their way from reaching their own goal. The next thing in Act 2 is plot point 2. So the aftermath of the midpoint, the aftermath of that big failure, this is your next main plot point. This is when the characters start to realize the truth. Any of the
lies where I'm telling you I'm a super well-trained hero, and it turns out, because of the midpoint failure, that's not the case. I have to confess, I'm sorry, I've never actually used my superpowers before.
All of the secrets that your characters have kept hidden are starting to come out. And it could be the villain is releasing them and making them turn on each other. And it creates a lot of good internal tension in your group of friends and adventurers.
Because if they break apart, the villain's job is a lot easier.
And the biggest part of this is that it leads to the darkest moment. You are here at the midpoint, and if you remember that chart, it's falling into the plot point 2.
This darkest moment needs to be set up well in order for us to feel the impact of that darkest moment. So if we aren't familiar with Obi-Wan and we don't kind of see him, say, try to play chess against the Wookiee or whatever it is, then we don't have that emotional connection that's really necessary for the next part.
So the next other thing that you need to make sure you establish within the act that aren't necessarily part of the plot points is that you need to deepen the understanding of what was established during Act 1. So this is a lot of your backstory for the characters as well as the world building itself. This is your training montage act where the character learns all about the magic system as well as your reader.
Remember, Act 1 is going to be your foundation. Act 2 is where we get to the details. Magic exists. This is how magic exists.
Now on to Act 3. The first thing that happens is what's called the pre-climax, and it is starting with that darkest moment, your character's most desperate hour.
That often comes in the loss of the mentor character that we mentioned earlier this week. The mentor character has to be gone in some way. We have to lose Obi-Wan, we have to lose Yoda before the heroes can truly succeed. Otherwise, the mentor character should be the hero.
You also get to glimpse the villain's true strength during this act. We saw a little bit of it at the midpoint, but this is at the darkest moment. We see the villain at the height of their power. They are absolutely dominating the world or whatever problem that you have. They are on top right now.
This is also a reminder to your characters of what the cost is should they fail. So this is what the world is like under Voldemort's reign. Not good. Harry Potter needs to succeed. And that leads to your climax, that final conflict face-to-face at Hogwarts.
So it is that final face-off, that last desperate moment, and it usually only lasts a single scene. You know, if you take multiple point of views, they're different scenes technically, but it is all the same main event. It is the same battle. It's the same thing.
Same time and generally the same place. If you're doing something like a heist story where you have characters that are all moving in sync across Las Vegas, then you have a little bit less of the all in one place, but it should all happen simultaneously.
So once the hero has won, the climax is over, the villain has been defeated, then you have your denouement, or however she pronounces it.
I've heard it both denouement and denouement. I think Castle pronounced it denouement. This is the payoff, the reward for all of your heroes' struggles. They get to go home. They get to kiss their true love. They get all of the things that they fought for so long. We want to see the characters happy. That's why we root for them throughout the entire thing.
So conflict is resolved. All of their goals are accomplished. Other things that you need to do, like we mentioned earlier, you pay off your red herrings, you pay off your footholds, you wrap everything up in a nice, neat bow.
If you have beta readers afterward going, well, wait, what happened to this character? You talk about them here after the final conflict, or include them somehow if you can, or take them out entirely.
Or write a sequel about them. Who knows? And then you also have your final release of tension. You need to have that relaxing moment to let your readers breathe. A lot of authors are starting to end their books on cliffhangers, and that can be a good thing if you know you're going to have a series, if you already have a deal for a series or something like that. But you still need that release of tension before that cliffhanger.
If you want a well-crafted cliffhanger, don't stop before the climax. That's an unsatisfying story. What you want to do is include all of the parts of this, but introduce a new concept. Something that maybe one of those red herrings or footholds that you've trickled in throughout. Introduce that new concept in a loud way so that the characters can then go, what? He was her father? And then they have to read book 2.
So one of the good examples that we included in our reading list is The Raven Boys. That series has fantastic cliffhangers. The main plot of the book is resolved. They have that release of tension moment where we see them in the aftermath. But then there's just a slight little upwards tick of the plot line at the very end that goes, oh, okay. That gets you excited for the next one, but you feel completely resolved with how the first one ended.
Your 7-point structure is the next one we're going to talk about, and this falls very well into that 3-act structure. We have plot points and pinch points, which are different than your rising action, falling action. That's the blue line, not the yellow dots.
I used the 7-point structure when I was crafting the story that I'm working on, We Are Not Built for Endings. I've learned that I kind of have to be that planter where I give myself vague points to go work towards, and this was a really good one for me to use because I started with the hook of the story and I was able to work towards every single one of these. So this design of the structure is kind of more about the character's highs and lows rather than the plot's highs and lows. So the character usually starts at a point where things are good, but they could be better, and it rises towards that inciting action. And then they get into a really tough spot, and then kind of goes up and down through there.
Something you're going to see across all of these charts is we start kind of on this side of the screen and we end up kind of on this side of the screen. It's getting more and more interesting until we get to the climax.
So in Act 1 of your 7-point structure, you start with the hook. This is the establishing of the status quo, the establishing of the characters and the world, and giving them a place within the story where they start.
If you read one of the books that we talked about for our rating list, The Line Between by Tosca Lee, it starts with the character getting kicked out of the cult. And so there's your hook. We want to know about the cult. We want to know what she's going to do afterward. There is a hook involved in the very opening moments of the story.
I'm going to disagree with that. That is more in Fichtean Curve. That is the inciting incident starting. The hook in the 7-point isn't the inciting incident. It is the status quo. It's establishing, you still need it to be a hook. You still need it to be intriguing, but it's not the big event that launches them into the story. Sorry to disagree with you there. Because that's plot point 1. Plot point 1 is that call to action, that inciting incident that directs them. So they start hook, move to plot point 1.
This is going to be the moment where Luke he gets the droids. He needs to do something with this in order to help the Rebel Alliance.
And then we move on to Act 2. The start of Act 2 is your pinch point, where the character gets into a really tough spot. There's pressure on the main character. So they have the inciting incident, but then they may not do something about it right away. There's something that happens that pushes them towards needing to act.
The next point is going to be your midpoint. This is when things start to change, and it's a turning point for your characters. Like we mentioned with the 3-act before, this is when they decide, things are going to be moving and stuff stops happening to the character and they start happening to stuff.
So to use my current work in progress as an example, the hook, I start off with her running away from a guards because they caught her stealing from the town and discovered that she is a necromancer. That's the hook. So it's this nice, exciting incident, but it's not what starts the story. The inciting incident is a thing that happens that forces her to have to leave her nice, isolated, lonely village and go to a big city so she can get necessary supplies. The pinch point is when the other character shows up and captures her and takes her off and starts dragging her towards her doom. The midpoint is when she decides, instead of just going along with being dragged, she's like, I can actually use this to my advantage. Instead of being passive about this, I'm going to be active and actually intentionally go there, try to convince him along the way to get on my side so that I can get this other thing that's actually more important than what I went to this village for.
And then you have the second pinch point. This is going to be a huge failure for the character. This is the loss of Alderaan. This is this proving that the character can't do it alone. This is often blocked in part by the lie that they believe about themselves. Maybe the lie is simply they don't think they can do it. They're not supposed to be a hero. This proves that to them.
So they finally made this decision to be active in whatever is happening around them, and then they fail at it. So it's that really terrible moment because they're like, this wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done this, if I hadn't made active choices. That leads into Act 3, where is your next plot point, kind of that they get out of that pinch point and drive themselves forward again towards being able to find the solution. That is not the actual solution, it's them finally discovering the solution to the problem.
This comes in conquering a lot of their internal fears, a lot of their internal structures, in order to make sure that they're putting the right things first, making the most important thing the most important thing.
And then that leads to the resolution. That kind of climax happens here, that final conflict is resolved, and the world is better. There's not much of a denouement in this plot structure, but it fits within the resolution.
You understand enough of the world to know we're better off without Voldemort. We don't necessarily need to see the train station 15 years later.
Yeah, we didn't need the epilogue.
The next step is going to be your Fichtean Curve. Again, we've got a lot of this tension and release and the rising action moving as things get more intense across the story.
This is a really good plot structure if you're writing a mystery or a thriller, because you want to start with the inciting incident. You want to throw people right into the action, and then every crisis is another thing that's forcing the main character, and kind of that ticking clock, forcing them towards that resolution.
So if you're familiar with a lot of crime dramas, even before you see the credits roll, you see the character running down a dark alley and then a dark figure going and killing them. That's automatically your inciting incident. You wouldn't have a murder mystery without a murder.
So, there's only 3 main segments to this thing. You can see the rising action, the climax, the falling action. So in the rising action, you have your inciting incident.
This should happen as quickly as possible. A lot of this happens in modern day, so wherever the book is mostly being read, so you don't have to do a whole lot of world building and telling your readers what McDonald's or Pepsi is, because they already know.
It absolutely needs to happen within the first chapter, if not within the first few pages. After the inciting incident, you have 4 crises.
In the case of the murder mystery, this is losing a suspect, or maybe another murder has occurred.
It could even be as simple as them finding the next clue in the event. It may not be like a crisis, but it is that major event. And every single one is bigger than the last. So we just found a even bigger clue, or this bigger thing happened.
Those dips between the crises are still very important. You need to make sure you release a lot of that tension so that there's a lot bigger scoop up to the next crisis, and we aren't feeling exhausted by your story. We're release and then building the tension right back up.
And every single one of these needs to foreshadow the climax in some way. That's really easy if each one is a clue that they're locating, but it needs to be something that builds towards that end. It can't just be a random crisis that happens. It needs to contribute to the overall story.
And then, of course, we have the final battle. This is where they know who the suspect is, they're going toward them, and they're not just going to go, well, you got me. There's a gunfight. There's a pursuit. There's some kind of struggle to get the bad guy.
So it can be that big reveal, this is the person. It can also be, in some stories, a terrible loss that the main character suffers.
Again, mentor character, big fan.
This is when all of those clues, all of those footholds finally come together in one piece, and your readers go, aha, that's who did it.
If you're familiar with Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, which I'm working my way through right now, he does a lot of confronting the suspect and just like, hey, can you come over to my house for a minute? I just want to have a conversation. And turns out Lestrade or any of the other law enforcement are there. Here's how everything went down. You're guilty. Ta-da!
And within this, your secret ingredient is revealed. That little piece that is that final puzzle piece that they needed. That one person coming forward and giving them that last bit of information so they could finally go and arrest the guy.
All of your major characters should participate in this moment. So at least we understand how all of these pieces came into being so that they make more sense. It's not just they were there and gone. This suspect that we had that turns out wasn't because they alibied out, well, they still were involved in some regard.
And then you have your falling action.
Again, your happily ever after.
You resolve the climax. You resolve any of the threads that were left over after those 4 crises.
And the suspect is taken away in handcuffs, and the world is a better place because your heroes saved the day.
That happily ever after and walk into the sunset.
I don't know why I chose that one. It was funny to me.
Sometimes this establishes a new world order depending on the kind of story that you're telling.
Freytag's pyramid is the 5-act structure. This is most popular in Shakespeare's style, where you literally have 5 acts. And there's a break in between each one because they need to do a scene change. But if you are familiar with maybe Midsummer Night's Dream, they get lost in the forest. They introduce the characters, they get lost in the forest. There's all of Titania stuff. There's the ball afterward, and then the happily ever after that.
So the reason why we have the split is they both have the same main structure, Freytag's pyramid and the 5-act structure. Freytag's pyramid is mostly termed and used for tragedies. It's that climax and then it leads to the catastrophe. 5-act structure, it doesn't always end in a tragedy, it just ends in a resolution. So in Freytag's pyramid, the first thing you have is the introduction, or 5-act structure calls it exposition.
This is when all of your characters go on the stage and go, I am this character, jazz hands.
Yep, you establish the characters, the status quo, just like you do every other story, and then you have your inciting incident.
Let's go out into the forest and go on a hunting trip, because why not? Nothing wrong ever happens in a Shakespeare forest.
That leads to your rising action. That is when they pursue whatever goal it is that they have.
This will often get confused and the goal will change for some of the characters as things develop. The next step is going to be your climax. This is where we're meeting Titania and Oberon, and the real chaos is starting to hit them in a major way.
Unlike the climax of the other structures, where the climax is that final battle, that big event, the big reveal, in this structure, the climax is simply the point of no return. They can no longer go back to the status quo.
The next is going to be the fall or the falling action. This is especially popular in those tragedies where your character is trying to do good and then they've reached that point of no return and then they start to slip and end up sliding down that dissension into villainy or madness or whatever else.
What's the Greek story I'm thinking about? Odysseus.
Yes.
So he had the climax. I can't remember the entire plot of his story, but I know he had a fall that was him murdering a bunch of people.
I think the sirens were here. So the climax, if I remember correctly, the climax was the encounter with the Cyclops, and then the sirens here, somebody needed to guide the ship, and so he had all of their men stuff their ears with wax, but he needed to be alert and aware. So he started to fall prey to the sirens.
And that begins the spiral out of control. During the fall, the tension builds. We are realizing that things are going bad for the character, and how on earth are they ever going to get out of this?
By dying.
Yeah.
You have that catastrophe. We see Hamlet die. We see the characters not quite make it home. We see the worst possible thing happen. And so your problem and solution part of this, the solution is there's no more problem because the character's dead.
Yep. So in the 5-act structure, it's the denouement. In Shakespeare, not tragedies. They end, things are resolved, it goes on to something better. But most of the time in the Freytag's pyramid with the catastrophe, the greatest fears are fulfilled. This can be a character's death, or it can just be them having that final fall from grace.
Your 2-act structure is most common, especially for musical theater, but a lot of your community theater, there will be people come in and all the characters are introduced, the problem is introduced, and then quick break while everyone buys popcorn and uses the restroom, come back for the 2nd act where we learn the happily ever after. It's part 1, part 2.
You have a lot of Fiddlers on the Roof, Into the Woods. Most of those traditional musical theater things are 2-act structure because of the intermission. Not because of it, but it's helpful.
It leans into it. Act 1 is your inciting incident. Christine Daae meets the Phantom for the first time. This is a great example of how they follow this type of structure of Act 1, Act 2, because we see a lot of the struggles that the character is going through. We see her in her own personal struggles of Carlotta not being a good singer and she's still a chorus member. And then that inciting incident where she encounters the person she thinks is going to solve all of her problems that just makes everything worse.
So the key part of Act 1 and Act 2 mirror each other in very many ways. So you have the inciting incident, and whatever their response is to that inciting incident is flawed. She trusts the wrong person to help her out, and they seem to get a win out of it.
That in Phantom of the Opera is Carlotta goes down, and she even gets to ride the horses with Raoul, and she thinks she's found her true love, and she thinks she's been able to get what she wants and get rid of the Phantom.
That's not how it works, though. Because Act 2 begins, and there's a second inciting incident. Something goes terribly wrong that shows that their win was actually a huge loss.
That's your masquerade, where the characters all get together, they're having a party, they're having a good time, they're like, the Phantom's finally gone. Oh, guess what? He's destroying the entire place.
So during this time, they have a chance to redeem themselves after their incorrect and flawed response of Act 1. They finally get to make the right choices.
So instead of hiding under and protecting the Phantom, she teams up with Raoul and law enforcement in order to capture the Phantom.
And they have an actual win. The Phantom is taken down. She gets to live happily ever after.
Until the second one, which most people pretend doesn't exist. For good reason, to be fair.
So the 2-act structure, while very basic, is still a very good. So it's kind of like taking your Freytag's pyramid and making it 2. So once you've figured out the plot that you're going to have, and you've started writing all of your scenes and you're getting into it, how do you know what actually belongs?
This chart is especially helpful in your editing if you need to chop entire scenes because something is starting to feel like it's slowing down or your word count's way too far. How do you know what to chop, what's interesting, what to keep? We have this chart where your plot is your rows and different types of things you want to include in the story as your columns.
So my Necromancer story, We Are Not Built for Endings, I used the first several scenes from this because I write by scene, not by chapter. So I have the scenes here, and then I have advancing the plot, the villain's plot, my main character's plot, world building, the main character's development, the romantic interest development, their relationship, and then something new is being introduced. This something new, as I go further down the list of my many, many scenes, is going to get much thinner.
But because she's doing an enemies to lovers, the relationship is going to start getting much thicker. I don't see this one getting thinner anytime soon because of who she is.
It will, mostly. So, if you can look at this, one of the ways when you use this sort of chart, you want to make sure every scene at least meets 2 of the boxes, because that means it serves a multi-purpose. If you can see, this particular scene right here needs to get cut, because it only does one thing.
Or, if it's possible, combine this scene with one of the others, or take some of one of these other plot elements and merge it with this. Maybe move the villain plot up into Janix for that. Include something from another piece, combine scenes whenever possible, especially if you only have one mark on your row.
So this is a very helpful tool to make sure that your scenes actually do something useful for your plot, because you have your structure, but sometimes we add a lot of filler. We don't need filler. We need something that actually pushes the plot forward in some way.
This is especially common in Act 2, where you're like, well, I can't introduce that yet. I need something to fill it so I can get to the good part. You'll start to see a lot more thin ones popping up in that then can be merged just to keep your momentum going throughout the story.
Yeah. So hopefully this chart, this idea helps you. If you want a more physical copy, just contact me in Discord and I will email you my spreadsheet that I have established for this so that you can create your own to start it off. And you just make it kind of however works best for you. I like color coding, so that's what I do. Helps me see things.
Overall, everything else that we've talked about this week, things have been fairly stationary. The plot is what keeps people reading. They like the characters and the world is interesting. All of these things feed into the plot so that things can change as the character grows and experiences everything you're putting them through.
Even as a pantser or plantser, I can recognize that a plot structure is a very good thing. You need that kind of blueprint for building your story, or in a pantser's situation, for editing your story. That way it feels complete, it feels whole. That's the reason for the different plot structures, is so that you have a whole story that has all of those pieces to it that will help your reader like the story, because nobody likes a plotless story.
Even in your experience as a pantser, the stuff that you didn't think about structure on, what has happened with those stories?
Oh, they died a terrible death a long time ago in my grave of forgotten whips.
They tend to fizzle out about halfway through Act 1, which is great. I have 1,000 of those also, but this structure will help you pursue whatever structure you choose, will help you pursue the story to its completion.
So these are additional resources that you can go. We talk about the hero's journey a lot. We even have an entire series for helping you fill in that Act 2 that's the most difficult for most writers. And then we have a notebook for you that you can fill out that can help you plot out that hero's journey if you need.
And until then,
Write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.